My brother betrayed me, got my wife pregnant, and now wants my help. Shocking true story. Imagine growing up in a home where every smile you tried to bring to your parents' faces was overshadowed by someone else's sibling who could do no wrong. That was Elliot's life, day in and day out. His younger brother Nathan wasn't just the favorite, he was the star, the golden child, the apple of their mother's eye. Elliot wasn't jealous at first. He was just a kid trying to understand why his mother always seemed happier when Nathan was around. Nathan could spill milk across the dinner table, and their mother would laugh, saying, "Oh, he's just being playful." But if Elliot accidentally knocked over his water, she'd frown and mutter, "Why can't you be more careful?" It wasn't just at home. Nathan was the kid everyone liked at school, too. He had charm, confidence, and just enough mischief to make him seem cool. Elliot? He was quieter, more thoughtful, but Nathan didn't let him stay quiet for long. "Hey guys, want to see something funny?" Nathan shouted one day on the playground, pulling Elliot forward like a prop for a magic trick. A group of kids circled around them. Elliot didn't know what was coming, but he braced himself. Nathan whispered something to the kids, and the next thing Elliot knew, they were chanting, "Smelly Elliot, Smelly Elliot." It wasn't even clever, but it stuck. Elliot's face burned red as he tried to walk away, but Nathan followed, pretending to be the innocent mediator. "Hey, don't get mad. They're just kidding around," Nathan said, but the smirk on his face gave him away. At home, Elliot tried to tell their mother what had happened. He thought she'd finally stand up for him, but she just smiled and said, "Oh, Nathan's just having fun. You shouldn't take it so seriously." Fun? Elliot thought. Was it fun when Nathan encouraged other kids to trip him in the hallways? Or when he hid Elliot's homework and laughed as he panicked before class? But Elliot didn't complain again. He learned early that no one was going to stand up for him, so he tried to stay out of Nathan's way. He helped with chores, he kept his head down, and he focused on school. Maybe, just maybe, if he worked hard enough, he'd earn some kind of praise. But no matter how many gold stars or good grades Elliot brought home, they were never enough to compete with Nathan's charm. Nathan's charm worked on everyone. Teachers adored him, neighbors gushed over him, and even Elliot's few friends seemed drawn to his magnetic personality. But Nathan's favorite audience was their mother. It didn't matter what Elliot did, fix the leaky faucet or clean the living room without being asked. It was Nathan who would get all the recognition. One day when Elliot was around 12, he overheard a conversation between his mother and a family friend. "Oh, Nathan is such a bright boy. He's going to go far," his mother said, beaming with pride. The friend asked about Elliot. There was a pause before his mother replied, "Elliot? Oh, he's dependable." Dependable. Not bright, not talented, not even kind. Just dependable. That word stuck with Elliot like gum on the bottom of a shoe. He knew then that he was nothing more than a backup plan in his mother's eyes, a safety net, if Nathan ever faltered, but never the star. And Nathan took full advantage of this dynamic. He knew he could get away with anything. One summer, Nathan accidentally broke a window while playing baseball in the backyard. When their mother came outside, Nathan pointed to "He did it," he said with a straight face. Elliot's protests were ignored, and he ended up grounded for a week. Nathan never even apologized. It wasn't all petty pranks and blame games. Sometimes Nathan's antics veered into cruelty. One summer evening, when their parents were out, Nathan invited some neighborhood kids over. "Let's play a game," Nathan announced, grinning mischievously. Elliot was wary. Nathan's games usually meant trouble for him, but before he could slip away, Nathan blocked his path. "Come on, don't be a wimp," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The game started with harmless dares: touch the freezing water in the backyard pool, eat a spoonful of ketchup, but it quickly escalated. "Let's see how tough Elliot really is," Nathan said, egging the others on. The kids shoved Elliot into a corner and started roughhousing. At first it was just pushes and playful slaps, but then someone punched him in the arm, hard enough to leave a bruise. Elliot tried to push back, but there were too many of them. By the time the game was over, he had a swollen lip and bruises on both arms. Nathan laughed it off, calling it just a bit of fun, but Elliot knew better. When their parents came home, Elliot showed his injuries to his mother. He thought, surely this time she'd take his side. But Nathan, ever the smooth talker, jumped in first. "We were just wrestling. He's fine, right, Elliot?" Elliot looked at his mother, hoping she'd see through the lie, but she just sighed and said, "Boys will be boys." By the time Elliot entered high school, he had almost given up on the idea of fairness. He knew his mother wasn't going to change. He knew Nathan wasn't going to stop. So he focused on what he could control: his grades, his part-time job, and his dreams of leaving home as soon as possible. But even as Elliot tried to build a life for himself, Nathan found ways to tear him down. At family gatherings, Nathan would crack jokes at Elliot's expense. "Oh, Elliot? He's going to be a librarian," Nathan would say with a laugh, mocking Elliot's love of books. Their relatives, not knowing the full story, would laugh along, leaving Elliot humiliated. Still, there were moments of quiet strength. Elliot's father, Lucas, began noticing the tension between the brothers. Though he wasn't home often, he started paying closer attention. When Nathan tried to hide Elliot's bike to make him late for school, Lucas stepped in. "Enough, Nathan," he said, his voice firm. It was one of the few times someone had stood up for Elliot, and it gave him a small glimmer of hope. But Nathan's cruelty reached a boiling point during Elliot's sophomore year. It was a Friday evening, and their parents were out. Elliot was reading in the living room when Nathan burst in, holding a lighter. "Let's see how flammable that mop of yours is," Nathan said with a wicked grin. Elliot froze. Was this another one of Nathan's jokes, or was he serious? Before he could react, Nathan flicked the lighter on and held it dangerously close to Elliot's hair. Elliot jumped back, his heart racing. "What's wrong?" scared Nathan taunted. Just then, the front door opened and Lucas walked in. He froze, taking in the scene, the lighter in Nathan's hand, the terror on Elliot's face. "What the hell is going on here?" Lucas bellowed. Nathan stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but Lucas wasn't having it. "If you ever pull a stunt like this again, I'll call the police myself," he said, his voice shaking with anger. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt truly protected. His father's words weren't just a warning to Nathan, they were a promise to him. From that moment on, Lucas made a point to be more present, supporting Elliot in ways his mother never had. Elliot's story was far from over, but that night marked a turning point. He began to see that he didn't have to live in Nathan's shadow forever. There was a world beyond their chaotic home, and for the first time Elliot felt like he might actually have a chance to find it. Fire and family divide. Nathan's latest stunt with the lighter was the breaking point for their father, Lucas. For years, Lucas had been distant, working late hours to keep the family afloat, leaving their mother to handle most of the parenting. But now he couldn't ignore the growing divide between his sons, or the danger Nathan was becoming. After the lighter incident, Lucas sat both boys down in the living room. His face was stern, the kind of expression that made it clear there would be no room for excuses or lies. Nathan slouched in his chair, his usual smirk plastered across his face. Elliot sat stiffly, unsure of what was coming. "This ends now," Lucas said, his voice steady but firm. He looked directly at Nathan. "I've let too much slide. What you did last night wasn't just a prank. It was dangerous. You could have seriously hurt your brother." Nathan rolled his eyes. "It was a joke, Dad. Elliot's fine." "No, Nathan," Lucas snapped, his tone sharp enough to make both boys flinch. "This isn't funny, and if I ever catch you pulling a stunt like that again, I won't hesitate to call the police. Do you understand me?" Nathan's smirk faltered, but he nodded reluctantly. Lucas turned to Elliot and said something that caught him completely off guard. "I should have stepped in a long time ago. I'm sorry." Those words hung in the air, heavier than Elliot had expected. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged how unfair things had been. For years, Elliot had felt invisible, his struggles dismissed or ignored, and now his father was finally seeing him. It didn't erase the years of neglect, but it was a start. From that day on, Lucas made a conscious effort to support Elliot. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Lucas was still busy with work, and their mother remained firmly on Nathan's side, but it was enough to give Elliot a glimmer of hope. One of the first things Lucas did was enroll Elliot in self-defense classes. "You need to be able to stand up for yourself," he said, handing Elliot a flyer for a local martial arts studio. Elliot wasn't sure about it at first, but after a few lessons he started to feel a shift. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel completely powerless. Nathan, of course, mocked him endlessly. "What are you going to do, karate chop me?" he'd sneer, but Elliot didn't care. The classes weren't about fighting Nathan, they were about reclaiming a sense of control over his own life. Lucas also started spending more one-on-one time with Elliot. They'd go to the park, work on small home improvement projects, or just sit and talk. During one of these moments, Lucas opened up about his own childhood. "My brother was like Nathan," he admitted. "Always causing trouble, always getting the attention. I guess I didn't realize I was letting history repeat itself." Hearing this gave Elliot a strange sense of comfort. He wasn't alone in his struggle. His father understood, at least on some level, what he was going through. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Nathan, meanwhile, wasn't happy about the changes. For years he had been the center of the family's universe, the golden child who could do no wrong. Now, for the first time, he was facing real consequences for his actions, and he didn't like it one bit. He started acting out in new ways, pushing boundaries to test how far he could go. He'd come home late, skip chores, and get into trouble at school. Their mother, true to form, continued to defend him. "He's just going through a phase," she'd say whenever Lucas tried to confront her about Nathan's behavior. But Lucas wasn't backing down this time. "A phase doesn't excuse nearly setting your brother on fire," he said bluntly. Their arguments became more frequent, and the tension in the house grew unbearable. Elliot tried to stay out of it as much as he could. He buried himself in his studies and his self-defense classes, determined to build a future for himself outside of their chaotic home. But Nathan wouldn't leave him alone. "You think you're better than me now, don't you?" Nathan sneered one afternoon, cornering Elliot in the kitchen. "Just because Dad's on your side." Elliot didn't rise to the bait. He'd learned by now that engaging with Nathan only made things worse. Instead, he brushed past him, muttering, "I don't have time for this." But Nathan grabbed his arm, his grip tight enough to make Elliot wince. "Don't walk away from me," he growled. This time Elliot didn't back down. He used one of the techniques he'd learned in self-defense class, twisting out of Nathan's grip and stepping back to create space between them. "I said, I don't have time for this," he repeated, his voice steady. Nathan stared at him, stunned. For a moment it looked like he might retaliate, but then he just scoffed and walked away. It was a small victory, but to Elliot it felt monumental. For the first time he had stood up to his brother and won. As the months went on, the divide within the family grew deeper. Lucas continued to support Elliot, encouraging him to apply to colleges and pursue his dreams. Their mother, however, refused to see the writing on the wall. She clung to the image of Nathan as her perfect son, defending him at every turn. One evening, after yet another argument about Nathan's behavior, Lucas made a decision. "I'm done trying to reason with you," he told his wife. "If you want to keep enabling him, that's on you. But I won't let him drag Elliot down with him." It was the closest they'd come to discussing the possibility of separating. Elliot didn't know what to think. On one hand, he hated the constant fighting. On the other, the idea of their family falling apart was terrifying. Nathan, of course, reveled in the chaos. He played the victim whenever it suited him, accusing Lucas and Elliot of ganging up on him. "You're trying to turn this family against me," he said one night during dinner, slamming his fork down on the table. "No, Nathan," Lucas replied calmly. "You're doing that all on your own." The tension in the room was suffocating, but for once, Elliot didn't feel like he was the one being crushed by it. Lucas's words gave him a strange sense of validation, a reminder that he wasn't the problem. By the time Elliot's senior year rolled around, he felt like a different person. He was still dealing with Nathan's antics and their mother's favoritism, but he wasn't the same scared, helpless kid he used to be. He had grown stronger, both physically and emotionally, and most importantly, he had hope. He knew his future wasn't tied to the dysfunction of his family. He had plans, goals, and the determination to make them happen. For the first time, he could see a way out of life where he wasn't defined by Nathan's cruelty or his mother's indifference. Nathan, on the other hand, seemed to be spiraling. His grades were slipping, his friends were drifting away, and his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. It was clear that he was struggling to cope with the shift in family dynamics. Elliot felt a pang of guilt watching his brother unravel. Despite everything Nathan had done, there was still a part of Elliot that wanted to help him. But he knew better now. Nathan wasn't his responsibility. He had spent his whole life trying to fix things that weren't his fault, and it was time to let go. As Elliot packed his bags for college, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was excited for the future, but also nervous about leaving his father behind. Lucas had been his greatest ally, and Elliot wasn't sure how his father would fare in the increasingly volatile household. But Lucas reassured him. "Go live your life," he said, clapping a hand on Elliot's shoulder. "You've earned it." And with that, Elliot took his first step toward a new beginning. It's a new life and love story. Leaving home felt like stepping into a new world for Elliot. For the first time, he wasn't living under the same roof as Nathan, and the weight of their toxic relationship began to lift. The sprawling campus of his university became a place where he could redefine himself. Nobody here knew about his past. Nobody knew about Nathan. Elliot dove headfirst into his studies, determined to make the most of his fresh start. He wasn't just studying to pass exams, he was building the life he'd dreamed of, far away from the chaos he'd left behind. But even as he began to find his footing, the memories of his brother's cruelty lingered. At night, he'd catch himself replaying old arguments or imagining what Nathan might be up to now. That's when he met Sarah. She was unlike anyone Elliot had ever known, funny, smart, and full of energy that seemed to light up every room she walked into. They met during a campus volunteer project, painting murals for a local community center. Elliot, with his quiet demeanor and focus on the task at hand, had barely spoken to her all afternoon. But Sarah wasn't one to let people stay in their shells. "Hey, Picasso," she said, nudging him with her elbow as he worked. "You're making the rest of us look bad." Elliot looked up, startled, but then he saw her smile. It was warm and inviting, the kind of smile that made you feel like everything might actually be okay. For the first time in a long time, Elliot felt the weight of his past start to ease. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Elliot became inseparable. She had a way of drawing him out of his comfort zone, encouraging him to try new things and meet new people. They'd spend hours talking about everything: her childhood in a big, noisy family, his struggles growing up in Nathan's shadow, their dreams for the future. For Elliot, it was like discovering a part of himself he didn't know existed. Sarah wasn't perfect, of course. She could be impulsive, and sometimes her energy felt overwhelming, but she had a kindness that Elliot clung to, a belief in him that he was still learning to believe in himself. It wasn't long before they started dating, and for the first time, Elliot felt like he was part of something good. Sarah became his anchor, the person who reminded him that life could be more than just surviving. And she wasn't just good for him, she pushed him to be better. She encouraged him to join clubs, take leadership roles, and even sign up for a public speaking course. "You've got a lot to say, Elliot," she'd tell him. "You just need to let people hear it." After graduation, Sarah and Elliot decided to get married. It wasn't a flashy wedding, neither of them cared for that, but it was filled with love. Elliot couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness when he realized Nathan wasn't there. He hadn't invited him, of course, but the absence of his brother, once such a huge part of his life, was glaring. His parents attended, though the event was tense. Lucas was proud, smiling warmly as he toasted the couple. But their mother? She spent most of the ceremony making subtle jabs about how Nathan would have thrown a more exciting wedding. Elliot tried to ignore her, focusing instead on the life he was building with Sarah. For a while, things were perfect. They bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, and Elliot found a job that allowed him to put his degree to good use. Sarah brought her signature energy to everything, making their home a lively, welcoming place. Elliot thought finally he'd found his peace. But cracks began to show. At first, they were small arguments over little things like how to spend their weekends or how much time Sarah spent with her friends. Then, they became harder to ignore. One night, Sarah sat Elliot down. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her wedding ring. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's stomach dropped. He knew that tone. He'd heard it before, in movies and TV shows, always before someone said something that would change everything. "I've been talking to your brother," Sarah admitted. The words hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. He hadn't spoken to Nathan in years. As far as he was concerned, their relationship was beyond repair. But now, somehow, Nathan had found a way to insert himself back into Elliot's life. "Why?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. He wanted to be angry, but all he felt was confusion. Why would Sarah, of all people, reach out to Nathan? "I just thought maybe it would help," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You never talk about him, and I thought if I could bring you two back together." Elliot stood up, unable to listen to another word. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice cracking. Over the next few months, the tension between Elliot and Sarah grew unbearable. She insisted she'd only been trying to help, but Elliot couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could she not understand the pain Nathan had caused him? How could she think this was something that could be fixed with a few conversations? Then came the second bombshell. "I've been seeing him," Sarah confessed one night, tears in her eyes. It happened." Elliot stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. His wife, the person he trusted more than anyone, had not only gone behind his back to reconnect with his brother, but had also started an affair with him. "How long?" Elliot asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah hesitated before answering. "A year." "A year." That single word shattered everything. Elliot felt like the ground beneath him had disappeared, leaving him in free fall. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a betrayal on a level he hadn't thought possible. It was in the aftermath of Sarah's confession that Elliot finally realized the full extent of Nathan's reach. His brother wasn't just a presence in his life, he was a shadow that darkened everything Elliot tried to build. But this time, Elliot wasn't going to let Nathan win. Elliot packed a bag and left the house that night. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. Over the next few weeks, he leaned on Lucas for support, confiding in him for the first time in years. Lucas, ever the steady presence, encouraged Elliot to file for divorce and focus on his own healing. "I know it feels like the end of the world right now," Lucas said one evening, "but you've been through worse. You'll get through this, too." Elliot's new life, the one he'd worked so hard to build, had crumbled in the span of a few months. But even in the wreckage, he found a spark of resilience. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to rebuild stronger, smarter, and free of the shadows of his past. Cracks in the picture. Elliot always thought he had a strong sense of what his life was supposed to be. For years, he worked hard to distance himself from the chaos of his family, only to build something he could call his own. And for a while, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. But life has a funny way of testing even the strongest foundations. It started with small things that Elliot convinced himself didn't matter. Sarah had always been social, with an outgoing personality that balanced Elliot's quieter nature. But over time, her constant need to be out, surrounded by people, started to weigh on him. "Do we really need to go to another dinner with your friends?" Elliot asked one night, hoping she'd understand his need for a quiet evening at home. "It's just one night," Elliot, Sarah replied, her tone light but her words sharp. "You can't keep isolating yourself." Elliot shrugged it off. He knew Sarah didn't mean to hurt him, but the feeling lingered, a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind, asking why his needs always seemed to come second. As months passed, the small cracks in their marriage became harder to ignore. Sarah would stay out late more often, sometimes without telling Elliot where she'd been. She'd brush off his questions with a laugh, calling him paranoid or saying he was overthinking things. Elliot wanted to believe her, to trust the person he had built his life with, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, Elliot came home to find Sarah sitting on the couch, her head in her hands. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. Elliot froze. He'd heard those words before, and they rarely led to anything good. "What is it?" he asked, his chest tightening. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt. "I've been talking to Nathan." The name hit Elliot like a punch to the stomach. Nathan, the person he'd spent years trying to escape, the brother who had caused him so much pain, and now, somehow he was back. "Why?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. "Why would you talk to him?" I thought it might help," Sarah said, her words coming out in a rush. "You never talk about him, Elliot. I thought maybe if I could reach out, if I could help you two reconnect." "Reconnect?" Elliot cut her off, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about. Nathan doesn't change. He's not some lost little boy who needs saving." Sarah flinched at his tone but didn't back down. "I just wanted to help. I thought it might make things better." Elliot didn't know what to say. Anger, betrayal, and confusion swirled inside him, but more than anything, he felt hurt. How could Sarah, the person who was supposed to understand him better than anyone, go behind his back like this? In the weeks that followed, Elliot and Sarah's relationship grew colder. Every conversation seemed to end in an argument, and the trust that once held them together was slipping away. Elliot tried to focus on work, on keeping himself busy, but the tension at home was always there, hanging over him like a storm cloud. It didn't help that Sarah refused to cut off contact with Nathan. "He's your brother," she'd say whenever Elliot brought it up, as if that somehow justified everything. "He's not my brother," Elliot snapped one night, unable to hold back his frustration. "Not in the way that matters." But Sarah didn't understand, or maybe she just didn't want to. Either way, the damage was done. The more Elliot tried to distance himself from Nathan, the more Sarah seemed to gravitate toward him. And then came the second bombshell. Elliot came home late from work one night, exhausted and hoping for nothing more than a quiet dinner. But as he walked through the door, he knew something was wrong. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice barely audible. Elliot's heart sank. He sat down across from her, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "What is it?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she spoke. "I've been seeing Nathan." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. "What are you talking about?" Elliot asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Sarah said, her voice breaking. It just happened." Elliot stared at her, his mind racing. "How long?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. Sarah hesitated before answering. "A year." "A year." The room seemed to spin around him as the weight of her confession sank in. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate and calculated. His wife, the person he trusted most in the world, had been betraying him for a year, and with Nathan, of all people. Elliot stood up, his hands shaking. "I need to go," he said, his voice hollow. He couldn't stay in the house, not with Sarah's words echoing in his mind. He grabbed his keys and walked out the door, not knowing where he was going but knowing he couldn't stay. The days that followed were some of the darkest of Elliot's life. He stayed with a friend, avoiding Sarah's calls and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Part of him wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But another part of him just felt numb. When he finally returned to the house, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to get answers. "Why?" he asked Sarah, his voice filled with equal parts anger and sadness. "Why him?" Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was lonely. I felt like we were drifting apart. And he was there." Elliot let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he was. Nathan's always there, isn't he? Taking whatever he wants, no matter who it hurts." Sarah's tears started again, but Elliot didn't feel any sympathy this time. He was done feeling sorry for people who didn't think twice about hurting him. Elliot knew he couldn't stay. The life he had built with Sarah was over, shattered beyond repair. He filed for divorce the next day, determined to cut ties with both her and Nathan for good. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one that made sense. For years, Elliot had let other people dictate his happiness and his sense of self-worth, but not anymore. This time he was choosing himself. As he packed his things and walked out of the house for the last time, Elliot felt a strange sense of relief. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he was in control of his own life. Confronting the truth, Elliot sat in the dimly lit office of the lawyer he'd hired to finalize his divorce. His mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them stayed long enough to make sense. The betrayal from Sarah and Nathan had left him feeling hollow, like a part of him had been carved out and thrown away. The lawyer, a woman in her mid-40s with a no-nonsense attitude, slid a stack of papers across the table. "You're making the right decision," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Cutting ties now will save you a lot of heartache later." Elliot nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. How could walking away from a marriage, the life he'd spent years building, feel like the right decision? But deep down, he knew she was right. There was no fixing this. Nathan had seen to that. In the days that followed, Elliot tried to regain some sense of normalcy. He went to work, went to the gym, and even started attending therapy sessions at Lucas's insistence. But the shadow of his brother and the chaos he'd caused loomed large. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Sarah. Elliot had been ignoring her calls for weeks, but something about this one felt different. Against his better judgment, he answered. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice shaking. "It's about Max." Max was their son, or at least, that's what Elliot had always believed. But as Sarah spoke, the ground beneath him seemed to crumble. "There's a chance," she hesitated, as if saying the words would make them real. "There's a chance Max might not be yours. He might be Nathan's." Elliot gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Sarah admitted. "That's why I called. I think we need to do a test." The wait for the results was unbearable. Elliot tried to distract himself, throwing himself into work and therapy, but his mind kept circling back to the same question: what if Max wasn't his? What if Nathan had taken not just his wife but his son as well? When the results finally came in, Elliot sat in the same lawyer's office where he'd signed the divorce papers. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. And there it was, in black and white. Max was Nathan's child. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of Elliot's breathing and the weight of the paper in his hands. He felt numb, like the air had been sucked out of the room. The lawyer reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Elliot," she said gently, "take a moment. Breathe." But how could he breathe when everything he'd built, everything he'd believed, was gone? Elliot could have walked away then, washed his hands of the entire mess, and started fresh, but something inside him wouldn't let him. Nathan had spent years taking from him, breaking him down, and Elliot wasn't going to let him get away with it anymore. He called a family meeting. Lucas, his mother, and Sarah all sat in the living room of his childhood home, their faces tense with anticipation. Nathan wasn't there yet, but Elliot had made sure he'd be coming. He wanted everyone to hear the truth at the same time. When Nathan finally arrived, sauntering in with his usual air of arrogance, Elliot wasted no time. He held up the paternity test and said, "This is proof that Max isn't my son. He's yours." The room erupted into chaos. Lucas stood, his face red with anger. "Is this true?" he demanded, turning to Nathan. Nathan stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but Elliot didn't let him. "Don't bother lying," he said, his voice cold. "I have the proof." Their mother tried to intervene, her voice shaking. Nathan wouldn't. He couldn't. "Stop defending him," Lucas snapped. "This isn't about you or what you want to believe. This is about what he's done." For the first time, Nathan looked genuinely shaken. He tried to play the victim, claiming he never meant for things to go so far, but no one was buying it. Even their mother, who had spent years turning a blind eye to Nathan's behavior, seemed at a loss for words. The fallout was swift and brutal. Lucas, who had always been the more level-headed parent, made a decision that shocked everyone. "You're no longer my son," he said to Nathan, his voice trembling with both anger and heartbreak. You've crossed every line, and I won't let you drag this family down any further." Nathan's face twisted in anger. "You're really going to choose him over me," he spat, gesturing toward Elliot. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Yes, because Elliot has done nothing but try to hold this family together while you've done everything you could to tear it apart." Their mother tried to protest, but Lucas silenced her with a look. "You've been enabling him for years," he said, "and look where it's gotten us." Nathan stormed out, slamming the door behind him. For the first time in Elliot's life, he felt like someone had truly stood up for him and had chosen him over Nathan. It was a bittersweet victory, but a victory nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, Elliot worked on putting the pieces of his life back together. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where he could begin to process the betrayal and start healing. Lucas was a constant source of support, checking in regularly and reminding Elliot that he wasn't alone. Their mother, though still struggling to accept the truth, began to distance herself from Nathan. It wasn't easy for her, but she seemed to realize that enabling him had only caused more harm. As for Sarah, she made several attempts to apologize, to ask for forgiveness, but Elliot wasn't interested. He wasn't angry anymore, he didn't have the energy for anger, he just wanted to move on. Max was the hardest part. Elliot had loved him like his own, and walking away felt like losing a piece of himself. But he knew staying would only cause more pain. He made arrangements for Sarah to have full custody, stepping back to let her and Nathan deal with the consequences of their actions. Elliot's life wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but for the first time in years he felt like he was in control. He wasn't living in Nathan's shadow anymore, wasn't bending over backward to keep people in his life who didn't deserve to be there. He found peace in the little things: early morning runs, quiet evenings with a book, and the knowledge that he was free to live his life on his own terms. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his new apartment, Lucas called. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Elliot smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I'm okay," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I think I'm really okay." And for Elliot, that was enough. Nathan's downfall. Nathan always had a way of making himself seem invincible. He moved through life as though the rules didn't apply to him, and for a long time it seemed like they didn't. Charm and manipulation carried him through most situations, and when they didn't, their mother was always there to pick up the pieces. But when Lucas disowned him, the safety net Nathan had relied on for years disappeared, and for the first time he found himself free falling. In the weeks after the family meeting, Nathan's life began to unravel. Cut off financially and emotionally, he struggled to maintain the lifestyle he'd built on their parents' support. Friends who had once flocked to him started pulling away, realizing there was no more free ride to enjoy. Nathan was left alone, angry and desperate. Elliot heard bits and pieces of Nathan's struggles from mutual acquaintances. He learned that Nathan had been evicted from his apartment after falling behind on rent and bouncing between friends' couches. A small part of Elliot felt satisfaction after everything Nathan had done. It felt like karma was finally catching up to him. But another part of him, a quieter, more conflicted part, felt pity. That pity didn't last long. One afternoon, months after the family meeting, Elliot received an unexpected text. It was from Nathan. The message was short but heavy. "We need to talk. Please." Elliot stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He hadn't spoken to Nathan since the paternity test revealed the truth about Max. As far as Elliot was concerned, they were done. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a lingering sense of duty as a brother. Whatever it was, Elliot agreed to meet. They met at a small coffee shop near Elliot's office. Nathan was already there when Elliot arrived, looking nothing like the confident, smug person he'd known. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Thanks for coming," Nathan said, his voice quieter than Elliot had ever heard it. Elliot sat down but didn't respond. He waited, his arms crossed, for Nathan to explain himself. "I messed up," Nathan began, his hands fidgeting with the coffee cup in front of him. "I know I did. I hurt you, I hurt Sarah, and I hurt Max. I've been thinking a lot about what Dad said about how I've torn this family apart, and he's right, I have." Elliot's chest tightened, but he kept his face neutral. He didn't trust Nathan's words. "Not yet. I need your help," Nathan continued, his voice cracking. "I've got nothing left, Elliot. I'm out of money, out of options. I don't know what to do." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "You need my help," he repeated, his tone sharp. "After everything you've done? After you slept with my wife? After you lied, cheated, and ruined everything you touched?" Nathan flinched but didn't argue. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I don't have anyone else." "That's not my problem," Elliot snapped. His voice was louder now, drawing glances from nearby tables, but he didn't care. You burned every bridge you had, Nathan. This is on you. Nathan looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. I just thought. No, Elliot interrupted. You don't get to just thought your way out of this. You've spent your whole life taking from people, using them, and leaving them worse off for it. I'm not going to let you do that to me again. Elliot stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I hope you figure things out, Nathan. I really do. But I'm done. Don't contact me again. He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving Nathan alone with his empty coffee cup and shattered pride. Nathan's attempts to rebuild his life were as haphazard as everything else he'd done. He tried to reach out to their mother, but even she seemed to have limits. Lucas had made it clear that supporting Nathan was no longer an option, and though she struggled with the decision, their mother finally stopped enabling him. Nathan began to spiral further. Without a steady job or stable housing, he drifted from one bad situation to the next. He burned through the few friendships he had left, his desperation and entitlement driving people away. Elliot occasionally heard updates through family gossip or mutual acquaintances, but he kept his distance. Therapy had helped him realize that he couldn't save Nathan, and trying would only drag him back into the cycle of chaos he'd fought so hard to escape. And months later, Nathan made one last attempt to reach out. He showed up unannounced at Elliot's apartment, looking worse than ever. His face was gaunt, his clothes dirty, and his eyes glassy with desperation. Please, Elliot, Nathan begged, standing in the doorway. I don't have anywhere else to go. Elliot didn't let him in. He didn't even hesitate. You need to leave, he said, his voice calm but firm. Nathan's shoulders sagged. I'm your brother, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Elliot's heart ached, but he didn't waver. It used to, he said, but not anymore. Goodbye, Nathan. He closed the door, leaning against it as Nathan's footsteps faded down the hallway. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time, Elliot truly understood the importance of boundaries. He couldn't save Nathan, but he could save himself. As the months turned into years, Nathan faded from Elliot's life like a distant memory. Occasionally, Elliot wondered what had become of him, but he never reached out. He knew better now. Nathan's downfall wasn't his responsibility, and carrying that weight would only hold him back. Instead, Elliot focused on his own journey. Therapy, friendships, and new opportunities helped him rebuild a life free from the shadows of his past. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And while he'd never forget the pain Nathan had caused, he refused to let it define him. For Elliot, the best revenge wasn't anger or bitterness, it was peace, standing firm. Elliot had spent his entire life giving people second chances, his mother, Sarah, and most of all, Nathan. For years, he'd bent over backward to keep the peace, even when it came at the expense of his own happiness. But something about Nathan's final plea at his doorstep changed him. It wasn't the desperation in Nathan's voice or the way he looked broken and defeated. It was the realization that no matter how much Elliot tried, Nathan would never change. A week after their last encounter, Nathan tried to call Elliot. Elliot hesitated, his thumb hovering over the decline button. He could already guess what Nathan would say. Another sob story, another request for help. And for the first time in his life, Elliot wasn't interested in hearing it. He let the call go to voicemail. Later, when he finally listened to it, Nathan's voice was shaky, pleading. Elliot, I know I've screwed up. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm begging you. Just give me one more chance. Elliot deleted the message without responding. It wasn't out of anger or bitterness. He just knew that letting Nathan back into his life would only drag him back into the chaos he'd worked so hard to escape. In therapy, Elliot talked about the guilt that came with cutting Nathan off. I keep thinking, what if this time is different? What if he really means it? He said during one session. His therapist, a kind but straightforward woman named Dr. Harper, leaned forward. And what if it's not, she asked. What if helping Nathan means sacrificing your peace again? Elliot didn't have an answer. Deep down, he knew she was right. He'd spent his entire life trying to fix Nathan's messes, and it had only left him drained and miserable. It was time to break the cycle. Dr. Harper encouraged him to write down what he wanted for his future, what his life could look like without Nathan's influence. Elliot's list was simple: peace, happiness, and the freedom to live on his own terms. Nathan wasn't used to being ignored. When Elliot stopped responding to his calls and messages, Nathan tried a different approach. He started showing up at places he knew Elliot would be: his office, his favorite coffee shop, and even the park where Elliot went for his morning runs. At first, Elliot tried to brush it off, but one morning, as he laced up his running shoes, he spotted Nathan waiting by the park gate. Nathan's appearance had only worsened. His clothes were dirty, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Elliot, Nathan called out, jogging over to him. Please, just hear me out. Elliot sighed, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want, Nathan?" Nathan launched into another plea, talking about how hard things had been, how sorry he was, and how much he needed Elliot's help. But this time Elliot didn't waver. "You need to stop," Elliot said firmly. "I'm not going to bail you out, Nathan. Not this time." Nathan's face twisted in frustration. "You're my brother. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It used to," Elliot replied, echoing the words he'd spoken before. "But family doesn't mean letting someone ruin your life. I'm done." Nathan stared at him for a moment, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness. But Elliot didn't budge. Finally, Nathan turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For Elliot, that moment was a turning point. It wasn't just about standing up to Nathan, it was about standing up for himself. For the first time, he felt like he was truly in control of his own life. He started making changes, big and small. He rearranged his apartment, turning it into a space that felt like his own. He joined a local hiking group, meeting new people who shared his interests. He even started volunteering at a community center, something he'd always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for. Little by little, Elliot built a life that wasn't defined by Nathan's shadow. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Lucas was a constant source of encouragement throughout this process. He'd call Elliot every week, checking in and offering words of wisdom. "You've done the right thing," Lucas said during one of their conversations. "Nathan has to hit rock bottom before he can change. You can't save him from that." Elliot nodded, even though he wasn't sure Nathan would ever change. But Lucas's support reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey. For years, Elliot had felt like it was him against the world, but now he had people in his corner. The hardest part of moving on was letting go of the guilt. Elliot often found himself wondering if he could have done more, if cutting Nathan off made him a bad person. But each time those thoughts crept in, he reminded himself of something Dr. Harper had said: "You can't set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm." Nathan's choices weren't Elliot's responsibility. He'd spent years trying to fix things that weren't his fault, and it had only left him broken. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Months later, as Elliot sat on his apartment balcony, he felt a strange sense of peace. The chaos that had once consumed his life was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. He still thought about Nathan sometimes, wondering if he'd ever turn his life around. But those thoughts didn't carry the same weight they used to. They were just passing clouds in an otherwise clear sky. Lucas called that evening, as he often did. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Elliot smiled, looking out at the city lights. "I'm good," he said. "Better than I've been in a long time." Lucas's voice was warm. "I'm proud of you, son. It takes strength to do what you've done." Elliot didn't know if he felt strong, but he knew he felt free. And for now that was enough. Rebuilding life. Elliot sat on his balcony, the soft glow of city lights stretching out before him. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that felt refreshing rather than biting. It was a quiet evening, the kind of peace he hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. He didn't miss the chaos, he didn't miss the noise. For the first time, Elliot felt like he could breathe. The first few months after cutting Nathan out of his life were a mix of freedom and uncertainty. Elliot had spent so long defining himself by the conflicts in his family that it felt strange to live without them. But it wasn't a bad kind of strange. It was the kind of unfamiliar that came with growth. Elliot threw himself into creating a routine that brought him joy. Every morning he went for a run in the park. It wasn't just about exercise, it was about clearing his mind and starting each day with purpose. After his run, he'd stop by a small cafe for a cup of coffee and a quiet moment to himself. The staff started to recognize him, greeting him with warm smiles and easy conversation. At work, he found new motivation. With his personal life finally under control, he could focus on his career without the constant weight of stress dragging him down. He took on new projects, earned praise from his colleagues, and even began mentoring younger employees who reminded him of himself when he first started. One of the most surprising parts of Elliot's journey was rediscovering the things that made him happy. For years, he'd buried his interests, too consumed by family drama to make time for himself. But now he had the freedom to explore. He joined a local book club where he met people who shared his love of reading. Their discussions were lively, filled with laughter and thoughtful insights. It felt good to be part of a community again, to connect with people who saw him for who he was, not as someone's brother or ex-husband, but as Elliot. He also started volunteering at a local shelter, helping organize meals for those in need. The work was hard, but it was fulfilling. For the first time, Elliot felt like he was making a difference, contributing to something bigger than himself. As Elliot rebuilt his life, he found himself forming deeper connections with the people who mattered most. Lucas became more than just a supportive father, he became a confidant, someone Elliot could turn to for advice and encouragement. During one of their weekly phone calls, Lucas shared something that stuck with Elliot. "I always thought I had to keep the family together," Lucas admitted, "but sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of what's tearing it apart." Elliot nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. Letting go had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it had also been the most liberating. For the first time he understood that walking away wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. Elliot hadn't thought about Nathan much since their last encounter, but one afternoon, as he walked through the park on his way to the cafe, he saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench. It was Nathan. He looked different, thinner, more subdued. His once confident posture was slouched, and his eyes were fixed on the ground. For a moment Elliot considered approaching him, but then he stopped himself. Nathan hadn't changed. At least not in the way Elliot had, and Elliot knew that talking to him wouldn't lead to closure, it would only reopen old wounds. He walked away, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. Nathan's journey was his own to navigate. Elliot had finally learned to prioritize his own peace, and he wasn't going to compromise it for anything. As the seasons changed, so did Elliot's perspective. He began setting new goals for himself, traveling to places he'd always wanted to see, taking up photography, and even learning to cook. Each new experience was a reminder that life was full of possibilities, even after loss. Elliot's therapy sessions became less frequent as he gained confidence in his ability to navigate life's challenges. Dr. Harper's words stayed with him, though, guiding him when doubts crept in. "Your past doesn't define you," she'd said during one of their last sessions. "What you do with it does." Elliot carried those words with him like a mantra. His past was messy, painful, and full of betrayal, but it was also a testament to his resilience. He had survived, and now he was thriving. As Elliot's life expanded, so did his circle of friends. The people he met through the book club, the shelter, and his hiking group became like a new kind of family. They celebrated his victories, supported him through setbacks, and reminded him that he was never truly alone. On the anniversary of his divorce, Elliot hosted a small dinner with these friends. It wasn't a celebration of the end of his marriage, it was a celebration of the new life he'd built. As they laughed and shared stories around the table, Elliot felt a sense of gratitude he hadn't known was possible. One evening, as Elliot sorted through an old box of photos and mementos, he came across a picture of himself and Nathan as kids. They were sitting on the front steps of their childhood home, grinning at the camera. For a moment, Elliot felt a pang of sadness for the brothers. They used to be the boys who hadn't yet been pulled apart by jealousy and betrayal. But then he set the photo aside. He couldn't change the past, and he didn't want to live in it anymore. The life he had now was more than he'd ever thought possible, and he wasn't going to let anything take that away. Elliot stood, stretched, and looked out the window at the city lights. He smiled a real, unguarded smile. For the first time he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all, a legacy of strength. Elliot's life had changed in ways he never imagined. The chaos of his past had faded, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm that brought him a sense of peace he'd never known. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. But every so often, the past had a way of creeping back in, reminding him of the road he'd traveled to get here. One afternoon, Lucas called with a request that surprised Elliot. "The old house needs some repairs," Lucas said. "I was hoping you could come by and help me take care of a few things." Elliot hesitated. The idea of returning to the house where so much pain had unfolded wasn't exactly appealing, but Lucas sounded sincere, and Elliot couldn't deny that his father had been a rock for him in recent years. "All right," he said finally. "I'll come by this weekend." When Elliot arrived, the house looked almost exactly the same as he remembered it, the same chipped paint on the shutters, the same overgrown bushes lining the walkway. But stepping inside felt different. The rooms, once filled with the echoes of arguments and tension, now felt quieter, almost serene. As he helped Lucas patch up walls and fix leaky faucets, they reminisced about the past. Lucas shared stories Elliot had never heard before, stories about his own struggles, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. "You've come a long way," Elliot Lucas said as they sat on the porch, sipping lemonade after a long day's work. "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Elliot smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. The house, once a source of so much pain, was starting to feel like just a house again, a place where new memories could be made. A few weeks later, Elliot received an envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was from Nathan. He stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to open it. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to keep the door firmly closed. But curiosity got the better of him. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The letter was surprisingly short. Nathan wrote about his regrets, his struggles, and how he'd hit rock bottom. He apologized not just for the affair with Sarah but for everything. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back," the letter read. "I don't expect your forgiveness, but I needed to say I'm sorry." Elliot didn't know how to feel. The words felt genuine, but he couldn't ignore the years of pain Nathan had caused. Forgiveness wasn't something he could give lightly, and he wasn't sure if he was ready or if he ever would be. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward closure. As time went on, Elliot found himself reflecting more on his journey. He thought about the pain, the betrayal, and the struggle to rebuild, but he also thought about the strength it had taken to overcome it all. That strength had become his legacy, something he carried with him every day. Elliot began sharing his story with others not for sympathy, but to inspire. He joined a support group for people who had experienced toxic family dynamics, offering advice and encouragement to those just beginning their journeys. "You don't have to carry the weight of other people's mistakes," he told the group during one session. "It's okay to let go. It's okay to put yourself first." His words resonated with the group, sparking a sense of hope and determination in those who listened. For Elliot, it was a reminder that even the hardest experiences could lead to something meaningful. On the anniversary of his decision to cut ties with Nathan, Elliot did something he never thought he would. He visited the beach where he and Nathan used to play as kids. It was a small, quiet spot tucked away from the main roads, where the waves lapped gently against the shore. He brought a journal with him, something he'd started keeping during his therapy sessions. Sitting on the sand, he wrote about his memories of Nathan, the good ones and the bad. He wrote about the pain, the lessons, and the growth that had come from it all. When he finished, he closed the journal and looked out at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. In that moment, Elliot felt a sense of peace that went deeper than anything he'd felt before. He didn't forgive Nathan, not completely, but he forgave himself for staying too long, for trying too hard, for not walking away sooner. Elliot's life wasn't perfect, but it was his. He had built something strong and beautiful out of the ashes of his past, and he was proud of it. He knew there would always be challenges, but he also knew he had the strength to face them. As he packed up his things and headed back from the beach, he felt lighter than he had in years. The past was still there, but it no longer defined him. It was just a part of his story, a story that was far from over. And for Elliot, that was enough. A future full of hope. Elliot woke up to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. The world outside seemed alive with possibilities, a crisp breeze rustling the leaves, the sound of distant laughter carried on the wind. It was a reminder that life moved forward, no matter how heavy the past had been. He stretched, feeling the weight of years of struggle lift just a little more. Today was a new day, and Elliot was determined to live it fully. Later that morning, as Elliot strolled through the park, he noticed a small group gathered around a musician playing an acoustic guitar. The melody was light and joyful, and it drew him closer. Among the listeners was a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, clapping along to the rhythm. As the song ended, their eyes met, and she smiled at him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, gesturing toward the musician. Elliot nodded. "It's been a long time since I've stopped to enjoy something like this." They struck up a conversation, discovering they had more in common than just an appreciation for music. Her name was Lily, and she shared a love for reading and volunteering. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a spark of connection, one that wasn't tied to pain or the past. Elliot and Lily's friendship grew quickly. They spent hours discussing books, exploring hiking trails, and sharing their hopes for the future. For Elliot, it was a revelation. He'd spent so long guarding his heart, afraid to let anyone in, but Lily made it easy. She didn't push or pry, she simply listened and understood. One evening, as they sat by a bonfire during a community event, Lily asked about his family. Elliot hesitated but decided to share. He told her about Nathan, about the betrayal, and about the journey to rebuild his life. As he spoke, Lily listened without judgment, her eyes filled with empathy. "You've been through so much," she said when he finished. "But look at you now. You're stronger than most people ever get to be." Elliot smiled, her words warming a part of him he thought had gone cold. "I guess I've learned that it's okay to let go," he said, "and to make room for better things." With Lily's encouragement, Elliot began exploring a dream he'd long buried, writing. He started small, jotting down short stories and essays about his experiences. Writing became a way to process everything he'd been through, to turn his pain into something meaningful. One day, Lily surprised him with a notebook. The cover was simple, embossed with the words, "Your story matters." Elliot laughed, running his fingers over the cover. "No pressure, right?" "None at all," Lily said with a grin. "Just write what's in your heart." Months later, as Elliot sat at his desk working on a draft, his phone buzzed. The caller ID made his heart skip. It was Nathan. Elliot stared at the screen, his mind racing. He hadn't heard from Nathan since the letter, and part of him wanted to ignore the call, but something told him to answer. "Hello," Elliot said cautiously. Nathan's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I just wanted to say thank you for reading my letter, for giving me the space to figure things out." Elliot was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. Nathan continued, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm working on being better. I just wanted you to know that." Elliot's grip on the phone tightened. "I hope you mean that," he said finally. "For your sake." "I do," Nathan said. "I really do." When the call ended, Elliot felt a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he realized he didn't feel the same anger he once did. Maybe that was enough for now. Inspired by his journey, Elliot decided to turn his writing into something bigger, a book. He poured his heart into every page, recounting not just the pain but the lessons, the growth, and the hope that had come from it all. The book wasn't just about his past, it was about the future he was building. When the manuscript was finished, Lily was the first person he shared it with. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. "Elliot, this is incredible," she said. "You have to share this with the world." With her encouragement, Elliot submitted the manuscript to several publishers. To his surprise, one of them responded with an offer. The book, titled "Letting Go: A Journey of Healing and Strength," became a beacon of hope for others facing their own struggles. On the day of his book launch, Elliot stood before a crowd of readers, friends, and supporters. As he spoke about his journey, he felt a sense of pride and gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "I used to think my story was one of loss," he said, "but now I see it's a story of resilience, of finding peace in the chaos and learning to let go of what no longer serves you." In the audience, Lucas beamed with pride, and Lily gave him a thumbs up. Even Nathan's absence didn't feel heavy. Elliot had made peace with the past, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. As Elliot walked out of the bookstore that evening, Lily by his side, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The pain, the betrayal, the struggle, they were all still a part of his story. But they were no longer the defining chapters. He looked up at the stars, a smile spreading across his face. The future was bright, and for the first time in his life, Elliot was ready to step into it with open arms. Because sometimes the best stories aren't the ones that end, they're the ones that begin again.